violently. And when the fight grew really intense, the father threatened to kill the mother and also the little girl.
Right.
And he started towards the bed where the child was lying ill, and the mother ran to protect the child, and the child tried to talk but couldn't because she was so terrified.
Right.
And so, you know, the father calmed down, but even before he calmed down, the child started to go into convulsions. And from that time on, every time her father approached her, she became terrified and couldn't talk. And that's when her stutter began.
Right.
So again, we see a very, very clear start to it in that particular instance. You know, she's terrified, she can't talk. And this is, you know, these are key. And so another really good example that he gives is this. Again, another case example, boys playing around.
Yeah.
That it's, again, folks, you have to bear in mind these come from an earlier age. So to us, sometimes when I read these, they sound really extreme, but you know, the times are different. Boys are playing together and they decide to play a game where one ties the other to a tree, and they, believe it or not, they secure him round the neck.
Yes, I remember this one.
And then to add to the fun, they light a fire at his feet. Great fun, eh?
Yeah, piled wood around the tree.
Piled wood around the tree and him.
Right.
And then the fire gets out of control, and being good children, they run away, leaving the boy tied to the tree around his neck with a fire burning. Of course, naturally, he's terrified. And the reason we know about the tale at all is because somebody shows up, stamps the fire out, and releases him. But that's actually not quite the start of the trauma, because the trauma is he goes home. Obviously, he's terrified by those emotions and by the event and the emotions that come, and he wants to tell his mother, but he's afraid that not only is he going to get punished, but they're going to get punished, and even if that doesn't occur and they find out that he's told tales, there's going to be problems for him, so he can't speak.
Right.
And in that instance, that's where, he reaches a point where he doesn't want to talk, right? And this gets compounded. This becomes his way. This becomes the subconscious's way of dealing with extreme emotions.
And wasn't it true too that it was the action of that rope around his throat, kind of choking off his sound, whatever, that, you know, it gets associated with that traumatic event.
Yes.
And so you think about it, well, if you're choking, you can't really speak.
Right. And this, again, this comes to the very essence, folks, of the work that we do. We work on the basis that things become anchored to emotions in the subconscious mind. Events and emotions become anchored. And when they become anchored, there's an effect. And sometimes that effect can be quite surprising. One thing that we find that many people to this day seem, you know, confused and mystified about is that very often allergies can become anchored in this way. Mm-hmm. The conventional view is that all allergies must have a chemical cause.
Right.
And I can tell you, folks, from the work that we do, I'm not saying this about every allergy, but certainly we've been able to relieve allergies because they have an emotional basis. They have an emotional basis because a strong emotion becomes linked to what seems to be an allergic agency, and that produces an allergic reaction, which is then compounded over time.
Right.
And so if that wasn't the case, we would never ever be successful in allergies. Again, I'm not saying that all allergies are like that, but it may well be the case that many more are than we previously believed. And certainly I'm sure many more are than is commonly believed or accepted, because quite simply we know they exist and people just don't bother to even investigate those causes. Right. So it comes back to the same thing. Here we're talking about stammering and stuttering. Right. The links are the same.
Right. And then I'll bring up one of the other cases is that, you know, and this is a good example of a triggering event versus an initial sensitizing event. There was a young child, and at age 2, he pulled a tablecloth off a table, and dishes broke. Right. And his mother was mad and so forth, and his stuttering started at that point. But Dave Ellman said, it doesn't seem traumatic enough. Right. So is that really the event? So he actually took him back earlier than that. Mm-hmm. And what he found was that a year earlier, the child had done something similar. It was the father's birthday. there was a birthday cake on the table, and he climbed up because he wanted to see the cake.
Right.
And he pulled on the tablecloth, pulls the cake off the table, crashes to the ground again, and his mother is angry.
Right.
So in that case, now you've got two events.
And she scolds him, I believe.
And she scolds him
Right.
severely. In that case, now, that ended up being the initial sensitizing event. That first one, he didn't start stammering at that point. But the fact is that, so when you got the second event, okay, then it was the straw that broke the camel's back,
Right.
and the stuttering starts. And it goes back to a concept that we always talk about in hypnosis, compounding.
Compounding.
So the second event compounded the first event.
Now, let's be clear. Probably between the time, my guess is, we don't know, that sometime between that first event, the initial sensitizing event and the triggering event, my guess is that you know, a little child being a little child did things that displeased his mother or his father, and he was scolded. That's the compounding.
Right.
It's not the actual scolding, it's the fact that the scolding then in itself becomes the compounding.
Right.
Right? And this is why we can, and this is why we say, so one of the things, you know, for you parents out there with young children, be careful. I'm not saying that you never scold a child, but how we're going to see in the next case, the perception of the child is quite different. And by the way, I'm not Bill Miller. If it's up there, I'm Neil Myers. That's Bill Miller over there.
Okay, good.
But there you go. But it's the perception of the child. Now, what's the child thinking when he pulls down that tablecloth? Well, the perception of the adult might be that the child's being naughty or mischievous. The perception of the child simply might be that they're investigating and they're pulling up on that tablecloth to find out, just to get up there. There's nothing
and that was the case. The birthday cake, he just he was delighted by it,
he
wanted to see it.
Right.
Very innocent.
Right.
You know?
And so one has to be, these days, I think fortunately, we're a little bit more enlightened, and there are fewer incidences of, you know, beatings, spankings, scoldings of very young children. Although it still does go on. But remember, folks, a child sees things through a child's eyes, not an adult's eyes. And when we work, going back in hypnosis, it's the child's perception that we are dealing with. It is not the adult's perception.
Right.
It is not the adult's recollection or memory. It is the child's perception.
Right.
And the child's perception has value. And the child's emotions have value.
And remember, you can't define a trauma by what would be traumatic to an adult.
Right.
Because even small things may be traumatic to a small child.
Right.
Right.
Given, you know, certain events. So it's not the tablecloth.
Right.
It's not the cake.
Right.
It's the combination of the cloth, the falling, the cake, and the strong emotions of the experience of the extreme displeasure of the mother in that particular incident.
Right.
That begins that shock.
Right.
And the subconscious mind says, well, anytime that happens, you're gonna stop saying anything. You're gonna stop talking. That becomes it.
And the other thing to point out here is I don't think we've mentioned this in this show, but we've mentioned it before, is we always talk about this critical faculty. Mm-hmm. It's the barrier between the conscious mind and the subconscious mind. In hypnosis, we kind of bypass it, get it aside, so we can talk to the subconscious.
Right.
Because then anything you say goes straight into the subconscious.
Right.
Well, effectively, until age 5, there is no critical faculty. Mm-hmm. So a child is in a hypnotic state constantly.
Right.
So if, as a parent, you scold your child, you know, before age 5, it's definitely going in.
Yeah.
The emotions are going in. There's no protective barrier to it.
Right.
And even after 5, like we say, between 5 and 13, that critical faculty is forming, so a lot of it still goes in.
Sure.
So the effect of a parent's anger or other emotions or positive emotions, if they give them, are really significant to a child smaller than younger than age 5.
Absolutely, and that's why, folks. It may, and it's not, again, it's not it's not as if we're blaming our parents or our teachers for everything that happens to us. That's not the point. The point is that from a hypnotic standpoint, when and where are things getting anchored? Well, where is in the subconscious mind, and when tends to be at these very, very early formative ages. That's why we regress people. Right. We don't regress people for them to re-experience trauma. We regress them so that they can complete and resolve the emotions of that trauma. It's it's a process of cleansing. It's not a process of re-traumatizing. And that's why clients are not re-traumatized by these processes.
And that's really important, because you think about the event we're talking about with the tablecloth. Well,
Right.
that's not as an adult would look at it, a huge traumatic event.
Right.
But something like sexual abuse is, to a child, to an adult.
Right.
But you and I know from the work we do is that even if someone goes back, discovers that they were sexually abused, and they didn't know about it consciously, it had been repressed, they're not traumatized in the hypnotic state when we bring them back to that
Right.
age.
Or we should say they're not re-traumatized.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Re-traumatized, and they're not feeling traumatized again, re-traumatized, after they come out of the hypnotic state.
Right.
Even if it's a knowledge that they didn't have before.
Right.
So that's really important, because a lot of people are very afraid
Right.
of doing regression because they're afraid of being re-traumatized.
Right. And folks, we can tell you, it just doesn't happen in that way.
Right.
At least not the way that we do it. Right?
No.
It's so. It's okay.
It's not, and I won't go into anything specific, but I myself, of course, came to you initially
Right.
for issues that I was having, chronic pain issues, and I went back to events that were traumatic to the small baby, but yet they didn't re-traumatize
No.
me, either when I was in a hypnotic state or afterwards, and so forth. So I can tell you from personal experience, it doesn't re-traumatize.
Right, and in fact, one of the things that we observe in all of these things is people, after we've done, the period of the work, they're calm, cleansed, happy, content. So these are touchstones that we're working successfully. They don't come out of the office, trembling and shaking and nothing like that at all.
And that's important. You talk about calm and this and that, and it's important too, because whether they know about an event or not, that trapped emotion is still affecting them.
It's still trapped.
So in the end, they'll actually feel better
Yep.
than before they came in.
Yes.
They'll feel calm and this and that, because they didn't know about the event, but that emotion that was trapped with that event was still affecting them.
Absolutely.
Yep.
So coming back to where we were, stammering and stuttering, we have a case now which, in this instance, Elman gives a complete transcript, and Bill and I have both listened to the original tapes. He gives this very unusually as a form of regression, as a demonstration in front of doctors. So
Right.
again, if anybody's thinking out there, if anybody says to you that these are all stories, these are all apocryphal, they're not. These are real events that occur with real people, and in this instance, witnessed by a whole group of doctors.
Right, like you say, we've both heard the actual tapes
Yes.
from 40, 50
Yes.
years ago.
And you can too, folks. I mean,
Yep.
these things are available.
Right.
This isn't secret knowledge. It's kind of forgotten and hidden a little bit, but it's not secret.
Right, right.
So in this instance, it's a long section, and this is the, and Bill, you can correct me if I'm wrong about this.
Yeah, because this is a big one. Go ahead, yeah.
Essentially what happens, this person comes, and I believe he's 47 years old, or 50, is he 50 years old?
49.
49
I
years
think
old.
it's 49, yeah, something
And
like
the
that.
stammer and the stutter happens when he's, when he's 2, 3, something like that? I think it was.
Yeah, he was right down at that young age.
Right. So
yeah.
we're talking about a long, long period of time.
Right.
And Elman regresses him back. And we're going to talk about how Elman regresses in a moment.
Right.
Because there's a difference between what he does.
What he does and what we do.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, what he finds is it starts when his father beats him, right? He's playing in the yard, he's dirty, actually he's 3 years old, it says here.
Oh, excellent, yeah.
And his father starts to, I think his father was drunk, but he starts he starts to beat him. And Owen asked him, why did he beat you? And he says, because I did something that he didn't want me to do. What did you do? And the first thing he says, folks, is, I don't know. He can't remember. He really can't.
Right.
And Elman uses a particular technique. He uses a technique that we sometimes use. He drops the hand again. All of this only works in hypnotic state. And he remembers the incident.
He says, when I drop your hand, you'll remember it.
Right. And this is what he relates. They had some little wood chickens. I don't know what a wood chicken is exactly, but a small chicken. And the little boy drowns them. What emerges is that, and he said, did you do it on purpose? And the little boy said, yeah, I did. I drowned them on purpose. And at first when you hear this, you think, wow, what's wrong with this kid? You know, it must be something really sadistic going on. He's all messed up. What's gone on? You know, but it's nothing like that. Basically, what happens is he's a little boy, and he thinks these chickens are ducks.
And he knows ducks can float and swim.
And he wants to see them swim.
Right.
So what does he do? He puts them in water. And what do? They drown.
Right.
Right? So he did, and this is the precision and the accuracy. He does do it on purpose. It's a deliberate act.
Right.
But it's an act with no malicious intention whatsoever.
Right.
And when his father comes home drunk and finds out that he's done this, he beats the child.
Right.
And he beats the child, you know, severely enough. And then the child's trying to explain what had happened, but he can't because he's little and his father's beating him. But then it's even worse. He begins to cry. And then the father tells him that if he cries, he's going to beat him even harder.
Right.
And that begins the suppression of the fact that he can't speak. That's when it starts.
Because the cry was stifled in him.
Right.
And the emotion was then trapped in him, and he's not allowed to cry.
Right. And one of the most interesting little passages, he reconfirms this with the boy, and Ellman says, so that this would be just a little mistake that a little boy made. Is that it? And the patient replies, yes, sir. And Ellman says, and because he made this little mistake, his daddy came home and beat him for it. And now because he doesn't know what to say to daddy, he tries to talk and explain, and then the patient interrupts. It's a patient because he's there with doctors, and he says, the patient says he wouldn't, right? He's stammering there. And then Ellman does something quite extraordinary. He says, you'll be able to talk without stammering when I snap my fingers. And he snaps his fingers, and then he says quite clearly he wouldn't let you cry. He said the patient says he would never let me cry. And Ellman confirms it. He wouldn't let you cry? No, sir. I see. And that's the repression. He says, unable to cry. Did he ever give you any reason why he wouldn't let you cry? And then the patient said, he said he would beat me harder if I cried.
Right.
So Ellman says, you were afraid to cry, and that stammer represents that concealed cry. Is that what it is? And then he says something he says, I don't know, sir, because he doesn't know at this point. He just knows that it's there. So then the next stage is something that still makes me emotional, even reading it. He gives the little boy, or the man that was the little boy, the opportunity to do what he wanted to do all that time ago, cry. Right. And on the tapes you can hear he begins to sob and cry. Right. And that's the resolution. So what he's doing is, at that point, is he's brought him back to that age, and he's allowed him to release that emotion. Right. Because the emotion that was trapped, the stifled cry and emotion, is what was causing the stutter. And now in his hypnotherapy, he's allowing that small child to release it. Yes. Because that small child is still within us. Yes. Always within us, always exists. Right. Yep. Yep. So 46 years of repression and compounding of that emotion can be released once the emotional cause is found. Right. And although Ellman doesn't say this, but it's our contention, and the beauty of this process is that he doesn't have to go to every incident from then onwards of when he stammered or stuttered. Right. Once he gets to the cause, it's done. Right. It's over. Right. The emotion's gone. The emotion's out. Not that there was anything wrong with that emotion, and this is another very, very key point that I want to make to folks out there who may be listening from the standpoint not just of stammering and stuttering, but of trauma. We do not desensitize people to emotions. I repeat, we do not desensitize people to emotions. Right. Now there is a whole thing out there about desensitizing people. That's not what we do at all. We enable them to experience the emotions, resolve the emotions, release the emotions, and then they are healed of those old trapped emotions. Right. We are not desensitizing people. Right. I do not want to have a series of clients who are desensitized to emotions. Right. I want the opposite. I want them to be able to experience their emotions and release trapped emotions so that they can heal. Right. That's what we're doing. And one of the things is, you can imagine every time that, especially if he had to get up in front of a class,
and talk. There'd be a lot of fear before the class, and those emotions could get trapped. So he may have all these subsequent events where that stutter occurred, where he has emotions that are trapped, but you don't have to go to every one of them.
Right.
You get back to that initial, and you release the emotion there, and the subconscious then can realign everything else.
Right. Now here's one of the, let me talk about the differences in the
Right.
way Elman worked, because there are some key differences that I want to...
From what we do.
From what we do. And I'm not saying that, by saying this, it's not, to some degree it's a question of style, but it's also a question of efficiency and efficacy. The way that Elman worked, and the way that was worked in those days, and it's still worked by some people, is that he would take people back. So let's take a stammer or a stutter. He would say, well, did you stammer at 8? No.
So he'd do this in a hypnotic state.
In a hypnotic
He'd
state.
take them to age 5 and say, are you stuttering?
Yeah,
at this
so go
age?
like 10, 8, 9, okay,
Right.
no, yes. 2, no, okay. So you were at 5 but not 2. What about 4? Yes. 3,
Right.
no. And you go backwards and forwards like this.
Right.
And he's very skillful at doing it. So in other words, he's trying to stimulate that memory.
Right.
Now sometimes that's effective and sometimes that works, but sometimes people get lost in that process. We use a different thing. We stimulate the emotions that people are feeling when they stammer, when they stutter.
Right.
And let those emotions, because remember we're dealing with an emotional link. It's the emotional linkage that's causing the problem.
Right.
It's the emotional linkage to the event that's causing the problem.
Right.
And so we bring them back on the emotions.
Right.
Right? And we found this to be very effective. This was the methodology that was promulgated and taught by, amongst others, we mentioned him on the show before, Stephen Parkhill and others. And this is what we worked. So having got back to that event, we then work slightly differently. What Mr. Elman is doing is he is ensuring that the person has insight and then hopes that they release the emotion.
Right.
What we found is that if you release the emotion, then the insight develops, and then there are a series of insight processes which complete the process of healing.
Right.
And so the key is not, folks, just the insight. And that's one of the key markers. Insight in itself does not, unfortunately, produce healing. Even on re-experienced, revivified events. In our observation and in the observation of others, there needs to be some sort of emotional release. And again, it's not that one creates a false emotional release, having people screaming and shouting just for the sake of screaming and shouting. It's the release of the actual emotion that was not allowed to be resolved and completed at that event.
Right.
So that's one of the key differences in the way in which we work. And again, to some folks it may seem like a subtle point or not a point, but it's very, very, very key. There is still quite a lot of work that's done out there where people are looking to develop insights, but there's no emotional release.
Right.
And unfortunately, in our observation, that doesn't quite get the job done.
Right. And the other thing about it is, as we've talked before, is the problem with that kind of method, in this case, it works for him.
Yes.
Okay. But the problem with it too is a lot of times you can have multiple phobias, and they're all linked to one event.
Right.
So, fear of heights, fear of closed spaces, fear of spiders or whatever. So if you just went back on fear of spiders and try to find that event in time, you may not find it.
Right.
Because it's maybe not a spider event that is the initial problem.
A great point.
So you'd be hunting back and forth and it wouldn't matter. You
Yes.
wouldn't find the event. Versus if you follow, it's kind of like a thread.
Yes.
Motion is kind of like a thread between events
Yes.
that connect them. And if you just follow that thread, that emotion through the events, you'll get back, in our method,
Yes.
you'll get back to the initial.
And this is a key thing that I'm asked by clients, by therapists who refer clients to me. They acknowledge that there could be a cause to these things, that there is a cause, that they don't know what it is, and they ask me, well, how can you get back to that cause? Because they might have been trying to puzzle it out for years. And it's not that I'm any more brilliant at puzzling it out than them. I'm not. I follow the dictum of my mentor, Stephen Parkhill, who used to say, stay dumb. And what
Right.
he meant by that was let the subconscious mind guide you to the initial sensitizing event. And how does the subconscious mind guide you? By emotion.
Right.
Because that is the language of the subconscious mind.
Right.
And so what we do is we stimulate the emotions, and let the emotions guide us to that event.
And the funny part about it is like you say, we're the guide. Actually, the person themselves follows that thread, that emotion
Absolutely true.
back through. We just are facilitating and teaching them how do you follow it.
Yes, and this comes really to perhaps the most essential point, which is that who truly does the healing? Answer:
Right.
the client, the patient. They do the healing. How do they do the healing? Through the power of their own subconscious mind.
Right.
We ultimately are guides. In as far as we heal people, we heal them to a condition where their subconscious mind can heal them. And of course, we can only do that in instances where it is possible for their subconscious mind to do it. As you've heard me say many times on the show, we don't grow back limbs that have been amputated or cause. I haven't yet found anything hypnotically that's going to grow back my hair. Although, folks, if you know it, let me know. But where we can be effective, where there is an emotional root to not just an emotional cause, but a physical cause, a physical change. Healing can take place through these processes.
Right.
And that's the key message that we want to get across.
Right. They heal themselves. We're just the guides. It's kind of like if you hired a guide in the woods to take you to a remote lake. Well, he's not walking it for you.
Right.
He's just walking with you and saying, okay, do this now.
Right.
Go this way now.
Right.
And the person does all the walking and in this case all the healing.
And then this comes back to another key point, which we've said before and we'll emphasize again on other shows. You need two things. You have to want to be able to make that change.
Right.
We can't force any changes on people. Obviously,
Deeply want it.
Yeah.
Yes.
They have to want to make a change. And they have to have the courage to face feelings, emotions and sensations and the events connected to them, which were long buried in the past, so that they can resolve those feelings, emotions and sensations. And so integral to the success of our work is the concept of courage. Now, it's not necessarily as much courage as you think, but you do need some courage to go back in on that.
You know, it's a funny thing because that's so true, and I've thought about this actually just in the last few days because I've had some clients that didn't have the courage. All you have to do is have the courage to just try it.
Yes.
Just go do it.
Right.
And because when you're experiencing it or when you go back there, you're not re-traumatized.
Absolutely.
So it doesn't take courage when you're back there. So,
have courage, folks. Come and join us. Difficult problems that seemingly insoluble can be solved. And on future things, we're going to talk about other ways in this, how these processes can help with a whole variety of things. So we hope that's been useful to you. We're going to talk about these and other topics more. And we hope that this edition of Hypnosis has helped you. And we'll introduce these concepts